Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is not a direct adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim comic books, in spite of what the marketing and much of the first episode implied. Now, we could quibble over the nature of adaptation and other artsy subjects like that till we're blue in the face, and we will later on, but I'm more interested in talking about why things ended up this way, and whether or not the way they ended up is any good. As for the why, the best place to start would be the 2010 movie. Now, I like the movie, and I'm sure it brought a lot of fans on board in the first place. But it was a flawed adaptation. Aside from trying to adapt 6 graphic novels in its less than 2-hour runtime, the festering remains of the original cut ending where Scott gets with knives are all over the place, which is quite creepy. Scott himself, rather than being the likable pretty boy who's more of an asshole than he likes to think that he is in the comics, comes off weird and uncharismatic. And in an incomprehensible casting choice is played by Michael Cera. Ramona is played up as this impossible-to-please super hot popular girl, rather than just the kinda cool new girl in town. Which makes it all the more confusing that she, let alone anyone else, is into Scott. This, I believe, is where a lot of the criticism toward the series started from. If you're watching this video and use Twitter, I'm sure you've seen it yourself. Scott Pilgrim is often derided as incel wish fulfillment, or accused of centering Scott himself too much in a story where Scott is kind of the bad guy. Like it's Yeek or something, or maybe FLCL on a good day. And while that's somewhat true of the movie, you can tell the people who say this either only watched the movie, or only heard about the series secondhand, or went into the source material with that interpretation already in hand. No one actually went around idolizing Scott Pilgrim after the movie came out. That didn't happen. That's a guy you made up in your head. If someone is making a joke about Scott Pilgrim online, 90% of the time it's, haha, Scott dates a 17-year-old, because that's the only thing they know about it. If they knew anything else, they'd probably have a second joke.
How many times has this been repeated? How many hundreds of times? How many thousands? 100,000s? Millions? Trillions? I've repeated this worthless comedy show more times than I can count.
You don't get people reading Scott Pilgrim for the first time and posting in shock that they address Scott Pilgrim dating a high schooler on the very first page, if the well of discourse hasn't been thoroughly poisoned. Given that, when making a new Scott Pilgrim thing 13 years after the books ended and the movie released, it's hard not to entangle oneself in those criticisms and outside perceptions. And so now, in Takes Off, we have a lot of conspicuous decisions that would seem to address those criticisms. Scott disappears at the end of episode 1, so he's no longer centered, and Ramona takes the lead role. The Evil Exes get more to do, and Ramona has to directly confront them herself, giving us a better understanding of their relationships. Knives Chow doesn't go crazy and start trying to kill anyone out of jealousy, so now the victim of Scott's manipulation doesn't end up in a villain role. And this time, the main villain ends up being a future Scott who didn't learn from his mistakes. It all feels very pointed, like an attempt to show self-awareness and fix Scott Pilgrim. But is Takes Off good? Did it do well with its subversive premise? What do we gain from doing Scott Pilgrim this way? Well, a few of the Evil Exes get more fleshed out than they were before. There's new jokes that made me laugh pretty often. And maybe the broad concept of there's now more Scott Pilgrim stories in the world than there were before. Other than that, not much. The art style and animation are great, but this is a Science Saru production. That would have been true no matter what they made. In spite of the aforementioned fleshing out of some of the characters, the cast, on average, is weaker than they were before. The themes are handled much more poorly, the romance isn't nearly as believable, and some of these you might call a consequence of the 8-episode format, but that's almost 3 hours, and the movie was less than 2. No, a lot of these bad decisions feel like they were made for the sake of acknowledging Scott Pilgrim's reputation and addressing its criticisms. But as mentioned, those criticisms were generally unfounded. This isn't some controversial take I'm making, it's just the text of the books. Nega Scott was not a subtle thing, nor was that time Scott said, "I'm a bad person and I'm trying to change." Ramona wasn't a shallow, manic pixie dream girl for Scott to win as a prize, she was the deuteragonist and had plenty of depth and an arc of her own. Knives was a character of her own too, and did a lot of things besides date Scott and try to kill Ramona once. And if you wanted a story where the main villain is like a dark future version of Scott who never learned from his mistakes, I have a comic for you. It's called Scott Pilgrim. The villain was a guy called Gideon Graves. He kept all his exes frozen in tubes so they could never leave him, and he remembers his past relationships as much rosier than they really were. No, in trying to dodge unfounded criticisms of Scott Pilgrim, all Takes Off really does is repeat the arcs and themes of Scott Pilgrim, but without any bite to them, and usually bumbling ass backwards right into those criticisms. Ramona has the exact same arc as she did last time, learning to stop running away from people and accepting that she's capable of positive change. Except this time, she actually is a flawless manic pixie dream girl. She falls in love with Scott after a single date and throws away everything to try and save him. She immediately reconciles with her exes when prompted, and she never even just does something cruel because she's in a bad mood. And she especially doesn't get mad about Scott cheating on her. In the future, she's also a genius inventor with time travel rollerblades. She still looks like she's in her early 20s, even in her late 30s. She's still a roller skating delivery girl living in the same apartment, because what else would she be doing after almost 15 years? And she can go Super Ramona to become God to instantly resolve the conflict and kiss Scott on the mouth. Scott isn't decentered, he's way more important this time around. Again, Ramona goes on one date with him, and then dedicates her life to saving him. He's absent from the main story, but every character still constantly talks about him, and their motivations are shaped by his absence. Knives takes up music because Steven Stills needs a bass player to replace Scott. Young Neil starts working on a movie about Scott's life. Knives and Steven Stills write an entire musical about Scott. And then, in the last 2 episodes, he shows back up to become both the main character again and the main villain, who's achieved level 3000 Satsui no Hado, and everything is even more about him than ever before, without any of the depth that made Scott interesting to begin with. In the books, characters had whole lives to themselves that Scott and the audience often weren't privy to, that had nothing to do with the main story or the main character. That's gone now. Scott and Ramona's relationship isn't made more grounded by showing that they go through a rough patch and get divorced later. It's actually far less grounded, because we see none of the process of how they fell in love. We don't see them work at it, or go on dates, or talk about their relationship. We don't even get a suggestion of what caused them to break up. And there's this terrible vibe of they love each other in every universe and are fated to be together. Scott isn't more criticized here, he's actually closer to innocent movie Scott than asshole comic Scott, except even worse. Note that in the original party scene where Scott approaches Ramona, he isn't awkward. He's not the Rizzler incarnate, but he knows what he's doing. He's talked to women before. He looks and acts confident, and he only gets thrown off because of the weird dream shenanigans stuff. In Takes Off, he awkwardly sidles up and starts rambling about video games, a thing taken directly from the movie that only fits with movie Scott's characterization. In Takes Off, Kim recounts the story of how she and Scott got together, and it's the idealized version that, in the comics, Scott fooled himself into believing, because it was more romantic than he beat up some scrawny kid that Kim was dating. This is, again, more like the movie, but at least in the movie it's kind of implied Scott is bullshitting. So unless Kim is for no reason lying here, then in this world's version of events, the delusional, romanticized story is the real version. Given Envy Adams is treated like a cartoonishly evil cunt who would sing a sarcastic song at Scott's literal funeral, as opposed to the bitter but real person she was in the comics, I think it's safe to assume Scott's delusional, idealized version of that relationship is canon here too. Which means the only really shitty thing Scott did was date Knives, which in this version he gets off way more lightly for. No one really grills him for it. She never kisses him, he never actually has to break up with her or deal with the fallout of their relationship, and she gets over him in a few days and immediately accepts his apology when he comes back. They even canonized that stupid "the exes respawn back at home" thing Brian Lee O'Malley said in a blog post all those years ago. So now Scott didn't even kill the exes. Even though that means no one should have immediately assumed Scott was dead in the first episode. Man, even movie Scott, gave a token apology to Kim and reconciled with Envy, and directly admitted to the cheating thing. This is an important one to nail down, because if we're fixating on the idea that the Scott who defeated the evil exes still became a bitter, delusional loser, and then Akuma from Street Fighter, then what actually caused that? What bad things did he do that he didn't learn from? And what did this new Scott do differently that leads to that not happening again? Sorry if I don't buy that a Scott who got pulled out of Book 1 and dropped into the equivalent of the final fight of Book 6 is the better guy somehow. Unless this is an entirely different universe than the comics and not meant to follow them, as implied by the Kim stuff, at which point I ask, why are we even doing meta-commentary like this? What does it even mean to be so reflexive if we have to invent a completely new canon to do it? Now I can't even give you the benefit of the doubt and say that, for example, Envy still has her depth from the books, and it just isn't shown because the events are different. Now I have to treat this entirely as its own entity. Weirdly paradoxical, given that the twist won't even mean anything to you unless you've at least seen the movie to know how this story goes. It's almost as if, in order to incorporate baseless criticisms of the source material into the work, you have to completely alter the work, leading to playing directly into those criticisms rather than subverting them, and a pointlessly meta story that comments on nothing except the warped amalgamation of Scott Pilgrim that was imagined in people's heads over the last almost 20 years. It's funny that they felt the need to canonize the respawning thing, because Takes Off also falls victim to another obnoxious storytelling trend, and that's that no one will stop crying and having redemption arcs. The X's don't need paratextual canon meddling to save them, they just need to get sad in the middle of the fight and talk about their trauma. There's this great bit in Book 3 where Scott and Todd are fighting inside of a discount store, and the stress of being in there causes them to both start breaking down. And Todd falls to the floor like, "Father, I only ever wanted to make you proud."
No, this isn't happening! There's no reason for me to go on. What? What am I fighting for?
Like, haha, wouldn't it be stupid if we stopped the whole fight so Todd could be given an out-of-nowhere burst of characterization for the sake of drama? Look, I like a good redemption arc. I like Zuko. I even like Catra. And, of course, I like Scott Pilgrim. But insisting on a heel face turn for every evil X, as if to say that their original characters were some sort of mistake or didn't have enough significance on Ramona's story, is nonsense, and implies a supremacy of this version of events over the comics. Look guys, when Scott's not here and Ramona gets to do everything, things go so much better. Aren't you glad the X's are so much deeper now? Well, no, not really. First, depth isn't the end-all be-all of writing. I don't need every random background character to have depth, and the X's were there to facilitate Scott and Ramona's arcs, not their own. Lucas Lee was an intentional anti-climax so that Book 2 could focus on Knives and setting up Envy, two far more important characters who will actually remain relevant for the rest of the story. I guess you could give him depth, but then I'd ask, for what purpose? This episode is a plot cul-de-sac where Ramona doesn't get any closer to finding Scott, except in the last few seconds where she happens to run into Todd, a character she would have been looking for anyway. Same for Roxy, who was already probably the most developed X next to Gideon, and she's basically only here to be crossed off Ramona's suspects list. Gideon himself gets a weird, irrelevant sad boy arc that doesn't go anywhere, and all I can think while we're giving him all this sympathy is, does he still have all his ex-girlfriends frozen in tubes right now? Or have we fully accepted that he's no longer a reflection of Scott on any level? Oh, I guess he's still evil at the end? He doesn't actually get to do anything, but he does explain his evil plan in the worst possible moment to do so, for some reason, and maybe set up a Season 2 plot hook, if that ever happens. The rest of the X's are as shallow as ever. Matthew has a fight scene that goes on way too long in episode 2 where he beats Gideon and takes over, the G Corporation, and proceeds to do nothing for the rest of the show. It's very embarrassing and trying way too hard to be surprising, honestly. They don't even try with Todd or the Katayanagi twins. Todd is just a weird gay laughingstock now, and his episode sucks. He doesn't even have the mostly jokey depth he got in the comics. And the twins get less speaking lines here than they even did in the comics, where they were arguably the most plot devicey of any of the X's. They also don't get their own episode like the others do. Most of the X's barely even talk to Ramona. And for all this, what do the X's do? They show up in the final episode and get their asses kicked by future Scott while one of the boss themes from the game plays. Not even, like, the final boss theme, maybe to symbolize that Scott kinda did end up becoming Gideon. Just the generic mini-boss theme. Kinda pandering, isn't it? Busting out the game soundtrack. Let me lay my bona fides out on the table and say, I first read these books when I was like 14. I still own the original 6-volume set in black and white, with the poster and everything. I've read the comics many times over, seen the movie many times over, and I own the game on 3 separate platforms, including physically. I've seen Anamanaguchi live in concert and heard them play songs off the game's soundtrack. I was even a complete asshole in my late teens and early 20s. I really lived the Scott Pilgrim life. And maybe you think that undermines my criticism of something meant to catch old fans off guard. I must have just gotten offended by the twist and upset that it wasn't a straight adaptation of the comics that were so formative for me. Maybe I'm just mad that Scott's not the main character, and I'm exactly the type of guy the show is criticizing. Well, hopefully I've laid out enough arguments that show that's not the case, but let me say what I think is really the critical flaw that made this show not work. And hopefully that'll exonerate me. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is way too reverent towards Scott Pilgrim. It holds Scott Pilgrim so sacred and wants everyone else's approval so badly that it twists itself in knots to accommodate everyone who ever criticized it. It wants so badly for everyone to like Scott Pilgrim as much as it does that it will turn Scott Pilgrim into anything it thinks they'll like. And in the process, it'll smooth out all the rough edges and only give you the fantasy version of Scott Pilgrim that exists in its head. It pokes fun at the movie, making it out to be an over-romanticized, unrealistic version of the story, but this is way worse. Knives doesn't react poorly to being victimized and lash out and then slowly grow up. She's the cute anime girl off to the side that you go, aww, at. Kim isn't a damaged person who's resentful toward the way her life is gone, or that a friend who she cares about is kind of a shitty guy. She's just the sarcastic one. Here's one that really got up my ass. Young Neil calls himself Young Neil. Young Neil doesn't like being Young Neil. He just calls himself Neil, and he goes on a whole Punished arc and gets pissed about everyone calling him Young. Have we really babyfied even Young Neil? Not even Young Neil can be kind of an asshole or have any flaws. He's just a wholesome little scrimblow who's dumber than a pile of rocks. I didn't know it was possible for a show to exist purely to give people new Twitter profile pictures of their favorite literally me Scrunkly, but here we are. Scott doesn't kill anyone, he didn't do any of the bad things he did before, and if he did, it's not as bad. Ramona cheated on all her exes, but they all forgive her when she says sorry. All the exes are actually nice and only needed a short talking to. Every side character is an innocent blorbo who loves and supports Scott and Ramona at all times. We got the entire movie cast back, even if their voice performances aren't great. We got Brian Lee O'Malley and Edgar Wright on board. We have Anamanaguchi doing the music. Emily Haines sings a song as Envy like how Brie Larson sung a Metric song in the movie. We'll even play the Plumtree song the series is named after over the credits. A song that the movie tastefully chose to only play a few seconds of. Please like our new and improved Scott Pilgrim. That overly romanticized movie we were poking fun at will include a few jokes ripped directly from it so you can recognize the references. We're so desperate that we'll even have SSJ Ramona talk about how every Scott is the same, as if to say, all adaptations of Scott Pilgrim are equally Scott Pilgrim. I'm sorry, but no. I didn't accept the movie and the game into the canon or whatever because they cloyed for my approval. I accepted them because, in spite of their flaws, they were good, and knew what they were, and were confident in themselves. If not Scott Pilgrim in exactitude, they were Scott Pilgrim in spirit. And while I've criticized both many times, I did so out of affection. And I'm not going to fall for this unfalsifiable, built-in criticism deflection where I have to like this new thing because it's declared that it's already worthy of that affection, or that I only don't like it because of its subversive twist. Scott Pilgrim was already subversive. You're not pulling that one on me. It was a 2004 independent graphic novel set in Toronto about relationships and everyday life and youth culture, where the main character was more fucked up than he lets on, and people have to pay rent. That might sound pretty typical today, but in 2004, right after the 90s edgelord era of comic books, that was new. That was subversive. Maybe in the MCU multiverse-dominated world of today, it could have been a breath of fresh air again. But no, now Scott Pilgrim has multiverses and alternate selves and time travel too, so we can fix it. And in this process, we've lost the warmth. We've lost the closeness and the intimacy that made up most of the book's pages. We have cartoony, over-the-top antics and blandly lovable characters doing comedy and action constantly for your attention, and none of the grounded human connections that actually defined the books. All those scenes of complicated characters, sitting in rooms, being close to one another, convincing you of the chemistry and the romance. Gone in favor of a twist that didn't actually accomplish anything, and action scenes that look cool but go nowhere. The mundane, everyday scenes that grounded the characters and made the tastefully sparse fantasy elements believable are gone. We're so hard up for the essence of Scott Pilgrim that the naturalistic romance printed on every page of the comics is reduced down to sparks as a signifier of real attraction. You want to know some real criticisms of Scott Pilgrim? The ones that the show absolutely did not address? How about the fact that the only non-white character of any real significance is Knives Chow with her black circle eyes? How about Matthew Patel's weird Bollywood stuff? How about the Kata Yanagi twins being genius robot scientists just because they're Japanese? How about the fact that, while containing lots of queer characters, Scott Pilgrim doesn't have any trans characters? You could have added one, maybe updated the comic's claim to fame of having such a casually gay cast. If anything, Takes Off is less queer than the comics. Steven Stills doesn't come out, and Joseph isn't here at all. No other Scott, no Roxy and Ramona making out. Kim and Roxy kiss and go, not feeling it. Wallace and Todd are like a complete joke of a pairing. Wallace's future husband isn't named or shown. Where is all the gay shit? You had such an easy in to actually update Scott Pilgrim, and you didn't take it. What is the point? There's this tendency nowadays to dismiss direct adaptation as a sort of fool's errand. As if to say, we already have this story, why are we getting it again in another form? In the case of Scott Pilgrim, this is, again, an unfounded criticism that comes primarily from people who haven't read the comics. People wanted a new adaptation of Scott Pilgrim because the previous ones weren't really all that faithful. Come on now. But I do sympathize, and on some level agree. If all you're going to make is an inferior Scott Pilgrim, then I'd rather you make something else. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater and act as though adaptation is, in and of itself, pointless. The movie wasn't inferior Scott Pilgrim, it was live-action Scott Pilgrim, with really cool visual effects, and great direction, and funny new jokes, and clever truncations of the comics' events, and banging music. It's not as good as the comics, but it has lots of value in itself. Same for the game. A direct adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim comics by Science Saru, even if not as good as the comics, could have been incredible, and reached enough people to finally correct the record on what this series is. Let's not forget that the movie infamously bombed. The perceived cultural saturation of
Scott Pilgrim versus the World
was always at least partly imagined. And the first episode of Takes Off, including some of the changes, is great. I like the direction, I like the earlier introduction of Gideon, and I like the Japanese voice cast. Look how cool this action is. Look how good the intimacy between Scott and Ramona is. You're telling me a straight adaptation with some changes to clean up some of the messier parts of the comics couldn't absolutely have been transformative enough to justify itself? Come on. No one pontificates over the nature of adaptation like this when a new episode of One Piece comes out. No one would have been upset if Takes Off had just been Scott Pilgrim. And what did we get instead? Well, we got inferior Scott Pilgrim. The same characters get the same arcs, but worse, with less motivation and less satisfaction. The story ends the same way, but dumber and less believably. Takes Off tries so hard to be the good version of Scott Pilgrim that it throws out the things that actually made Scott Pilgrim good. I'd have loved to treat this as its own thing that I can appreciate for its positive qualities while discarding the negative, but its own obsessive self-consciousness stonewalls that. I'd love to see more stories with these characters, but this is the same story as last time. Does it ruin the comics? No, of course not. But it damn well tries, and its existence will probably stifle anyone else's thoughts of adapting this series better anytime soon, as well as further poison the already painful discourse. I can only hope that someday someone will look back on this mistake, acknowledge it, move past it, and have the guts to try again.